We're good to go.
Welcome to Keeping It Simple. I'm
Hello.
Jenel.
And I'm Myranda.
Today we're going to chat about cyclical living and what that encompasses because it's kind of trendy right now. I would say people use cyclical living interchangeably with like cycle syncing and all this stuff, but really what does it mean, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's great that it's trending. I think it should always be trending. And I'm sure you'll feel the same way once we get chatting a little bit more about it. So let's just start off the conversation, Jenel. How do you describe cyclical living?
For me, it's pretty all-encompassing, not just like how we wake up and feel that day, but also encompassing like the ebbs and flows of nature. And I really use nature as a cue to my cyclical living because we're spoiled here. We get 4 distinct seasons that go through their shifts. We can feel all kinds of mental, emotional stuff through those seasons. And for me, that's how I honed in on it when I was like in my early 20s.
Yeah, and so you came to the concept and stepped into cyclical living fairly early on in your life's journey, around 20 years old.
Yeah.
For me, cyclical living just honestly only probably came up in the past maybe 4 to 6 years, maybe even less.
Yeah.
So not as early as you, into my later 20s. And how did that come up? How did you hear about it?
I was a young mom and was like, don't really like spending a lot of time in the kitchen, but that's obviously important to me and like to my life. I enjoy eating good food, and so you have to cook it. And so unfortunately had to kind of manage my energy in and out of the kitchen. And this was like the beginning of the blogs and the internet chats about women's health and honestly lunar cycles. And this lady tied in like lunar cycle energy into how you could use that to be more productive in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And, you know, tying that into like the full moon, having full energy, the peak of the cycle throughout the month or the lunar cycle.
Yeah.
And so during that time, we usually have more energy too. And so cook a lot. Like that's when you're making your pre-made breakfasts and like stockpiling lasagnas and soup. So when the new moon comes and we sink into that low, restful phase, you might remember from the moon circles when we like tapped into like the full and new moon energy.
Yeah.
That we maybe don't want to cook.
Yes. Yeah.
That might remind you of other cycles that you feel in your life where we like maybe don't want to do stuff during that week.
Yeah.
When we're bleeding, new moon, very related. And so I just kind of started weaving it into my life that way. And then, you know, the world kind of took hold of that and brought it into like the menstrual cycle syncing, all of that. Like you said, in the past, probably 6 to 10 years. And now it's kind of exploded a little bit on that front, which is cool because we should be thinking about how we are showing up that day and maybe how we can live more accordingly to what's showing up in our body and mind.
Yeah, and I love that you take cues from nature, and we're transitioning where we're at right now. We're in fall. We'll be transitioning to winter soon.
Yeah.
And so you came to cyclical living from the perspective of being in the kitchen and going, okay, when I'm feeling like I've got good amount of energy in this phase with the moon, more specifically, I'm going to cook and make a whole bunch of food. So then later, when I don't have as much energy or I'm, you know, not able to expend that in the kitchen, that, hey, I've prepped in advance.
Totally. It was life-changing.
Yeah.
As a like early mom.
Yes.
Yeah. I was like, oh, this was way more productive for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And like you said, culture and society has then brought in cycle syncing into different aspects. And, you know, I was introduced to a type of cycling when I was going through kinesiology, and we would call that periodization.
Oh, cool.
So in my reflection and prepping for this conversation, you know, I started to hear about people sharing, okay, when you're at different phases in your reproductive cycle. And so our reproductive cycle is that full cycle that we'll go through as a female. And we've got those different parts of the reproductive cycle. So, for example, someone saying, well, when you're in your bleeding phase, that menstrual cycle phase, you may not go to that high intensity exercise class or spin class.
Yeah.
You might decide to do yoga or walking. And so when I first started hearing that, because I don't practice yoga consistently, it's interwoven yoga methodology and lifestyle is just kind of interwoven. I was like, well, why would I have to, why couldn't I be just shifting my intensity with the exercise that I'm doing, not necessarily having to change the activity, which you could also do. And in my reflection, like I said, for today, I'm going, well, that's periodization.
Yeah.
Periodization from like a month perspective. Lots of time when we talk about training, if you're leading up to an event, it might be like a 6-month phase.
Yeah.
So really then being introduced to other ways that we can cycle through life and harness this understanding and idea that we don't just have to be go all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so what do you think one of the biggest benefits of integrating this understanding of cyclical living could be for people, for our listeners?
Yeah, it's a great question. The biggest impact I see is like less disease and illness. When you live in flow with nature and the seasons and your energetic flows, your mental capacity, your emotional capacity, like, wow, maybe there's a reason we have seasonal depression. Because in the winter months, like, we're not supposed to be doing stuff the same way we would in like the peak of July and August.
Right. And you mentioned that, right? How electricity, so if you haven't watched our episode on sleep, Jenel made an amazing point that I never thought about, and is when we didn't have electricity in these cooler, shorter days of the year, we would be hibernating, we'd be resting, or we'd be doing something that didn't require that light, right?
Yeah. Okay. And it's really noticeable here when spring comes and we like, everyone around us like totally changes even the way they talk or express themselves compared to like say January or February in Saskatchewan. It's a completely different vibe in May. And we do this a lot just like subconsciously here because we have such dramatic shifts in our seasons. But when you bring that like conscious awareness to it, it can really like alter your life. And you can bring this into like how you raise your kids and like how you do things, manage like planning. Maybe you have a big thing coming at work or you want to do things like a lot of these videos. Somehow I'm always timing them around like my ovulation, my summer, my spring, because I'm more outgoing. I'm more like, let's chat and share all this information. It's just easier for me and my brain to think on my feet, on my toes, lead classes. So I'll usually like organize classes and workshops around these phases in my cycle, in my seasons. So I'll like be way busier in the summer.
Yeah.
And like maybe work less in the winter, and like I have the luxury of being able to do that.
Yeah.
Just one bonus of being like self-employed.
Yeah.
We both can fiddle around with that. Like you messaged me the other day asking about my winter schedule, and I was like, oh cool, yeah, like I do different things in the winter than I would in the summer work-wise. So what are some ways you impact cyclical living into like your fitness routine or maybe even your sleep, because you might have noticed some changes when you're working on that?
Yeah, well, I definitely understand when you're sharing about from like the energy. And when we're not running ourselves into the ground, we're going to have better immune system regulation. We're going to have better nervous system regulation. We're going to have better gut health. Like all these systems that cycle inside of us are all then impacted by some of these bigger bigger cycles that are going on within ourselves, with our families, and then within obviously nature. And I think the big thing that has helped me so far with integrating awareness to cyclical living is I'm looking ahead, especially when it comes to training. I did a lot of training this past summer. I actually ran
some pretty intense
this
things.
year. I actually ran 4 half marathons. That was not like it was. Yeah, it was something that just happened, and it actually lined up that my events were all during bleeds.
Yeah.
Like right at the beginning or just right at the tail end. And so I integrated cyclical living from the perspective of going, okay, this is the training, this is the event, where am I going to be at in my reproductive cycle?
Yeah.
And how can I maximize my energy for that phase that I'm in? So when I was more in my spring, right, follicular ovulation, I was like, okay, these are the weeks that my training is going to be higher intensity.
Yep.
And then the week leading up or the week of, I decided, okay, I'm eating more warm foods. And that's something that you've taught me. So even kind of cycling a little bit of my nutrition depending on what's going on. Yeah, but then going, okay, actually my training sessions need to be shorter. Or if I'm going to have the same intensity, I need to make sure that I'm not putting anything in my evening so that I can go to bed at a pretty good time. So if I'm going to be exerting myself more, that I'm going to make sure I've got the rest.
Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah, and I think that cyclical living has helped me lean more into recovery.
Oh, yeah.
And so we hear a lot like, you have to train hard, train so hard. Well, I started saying to people, and it's kind of fun to see expressions because it's kind of confusing, but then they go, oh, that makes so much sense. And I'm like, you need to recover as hard as you train, if not harder.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
sleep. That on a bumper sticker.
Boom. Shirts for everyone. Right? And
amazing.
People go, oh my gosh. Right? And that's where, we're all about the foundations here and keeping it simple. And if we are negating recovery,
totally,
we are never going to have gains.
Yeah.
It's just a simple
depletion is
physiological fact.
Yeah.
And I think that we can do all the things that we want to do and live the lives that we want to its fullest and pushing and going with that consideration that we are taking that time for ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's the sleep. We talked last episode about sleep. I wouldn't necessarily say I cycle my sleep too much other than going, okay, here's the base amount that I know I'm always trying to get every night. At least that's 7.5 to 8 hours. And then, like I said, depending on where I am in my cycle, giving myself more space for sleep, for that rest.
Yeah.
My lens, your lens, you have an older child.
Yeah.
I do not have any kids yet.
Yeah.
So we are always curious how people take this information and integrate it, especially if you're newly postpartum or you've got toddlers, right? Cyclical living is going to have to look different for you. And it should be, because even though we've got these overarching principles of cyclical living, we can really take it and individualize it to exactly what we need, because inside of everyone's household, there's different things going on.
Yeah. And I started this when my daughter was 1. So it's doable.
Yes.
Because I was like, why am I so exhausted? I can't do these life tasks I've required myself to do when I'm in these lower energy phases, whether that's seasonally, monthly, or like you said, through a bigger section of change that we might be going through. Say we're taking our kid out of the crib into a toddler bed. We're going to have these seasons of change where we might have to adjust how we're approaching it based on our reality in that moment. And that's fine and normal. But we're going to have these foundational pieces to make it more productive and successful for us.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you noticed maybe, because that's a lot of training and a lot of activity, running. Mm-hmm. Did you get any injuries?
No, actually I didn't.
Yeah. That's like a huge part of this is like you will protect your body, protect your body, and allow it to heal and recover when you go with the ebbs and flows instead of just going like pedal to the metal all the time, which like culturally we really love. Yeah. We love like burning ourselves out, lighting the candle on both ends. Oh, you have a knee injury, like keep going. Oh, you have a headache, keep running. I see it all the time on people's stories. People are like, oh, felt so low energy. But then they have like 20 things on their to-do list. And it's like, it's okay to just rest if that's what your body's asking for.
Yeah. And so let's move into some simple little tips to help people integrate cyclical living, and definitely share. We love to hear. So if you've got tips that are really helpful for you,
drop them below.
Yeah, drop them below. Message us directly. This is all about sharing. So what would be a little tip? Say someone's just coming to our video. They've never heard of cyclical living before. What?
For me, the easiest, especially if you live in the Northern Hemisphere, in a place that has those 4 seasons, is using nature as your guide. You could just break it up into like the seasons. Think about it. Maybe you make a little piece of paper, 4 little squares on it, and just brainstorm like what it is that you see or do during those seasons. And then you could take that into even like a monthly thing. If you're a woman and you bleed, you could tie in your like cycle with those seasons and learn to manage your energy and physicality that way. That's an easy, quick approach with like, we know the seasons pretty well. We learn it early on.
Yeah. And that's such a powerful like external cue, right? I think something that can be very powerful for people is, and you said this is, tune inward. What could feel good for you in that moment, in these next couple of weeks? If you've taken a piece of paper, you draw out the 4 seasons, right? Summer is always go, go, go. Winter, right? So I think my tip would be gathering data.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy visuals. And so something that helped me through my training was I got this calendar from Dollarama. It was a big calendar, hung it up on my wall, and it came with all these little sticky notes that were different colors.
Amazing.
And so with my training, I would go ahead and I'd, write down what I did and document it, put it on the sticky notes. And it was such a great visual to remind me, hey, Myranda, you've just trained 3 days in a row at varying intensities, but still elevated, above, an 80% effort. This 4th day probably should be slower, or this is actually going to be a rest day. Now, I had that built in when I did my overarching training plan, but I think that was also super important, is that I wasn't stuck to this rigid plan that I was given.
Yeah.
That I was able to create a little bit of flexibility with moving some of my training, adjusting my intensity, and the visual really helped.
Yeah.
This could be something digital on your phone. It could be something on pen and paper. And the other thing that visual tracking helped with was including my partner.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you have young kids, this is how I did it. Have the family calendar there. You could have the lunar cycles. Maybe you want to have like your own like cycle on there so everyone knows where you are. Hint, hint, really great.
Yeah.
Or maybe you have like a larger training or something happening. That could all be written out there on the calendar for everyone to visually see.
Yeah.
And then everyone knows where everyone is in that season of life and like where they're going. And honestly, if you're the mom of the household, like you should be the one dictating this, especially if you're the only woman in that household. You have a male spouse, only male children. they don't have these ebbs and flows quite the same as we do. Their body rhythm is much more on a 24-hour cycle. And so we really do need to be the drivers of that household rhythm. Otherwise, we will get burnt out because those boys will just be like, let's do this, let's do that all the time. And if they don't have a visualization of like our energy, our emotional capacity, or what we can do with our bodies on a given day, it's a lot harder for them to meet us where we're at. So it's also a really great tip, the visualization.
Yeah. And it's in our nature. It's inside of us. It's what we're meant to do. And so there can be lots of feelings and thoughts where, well, you know, I'm being lazy or this or that. And really it's just creating boundaries and setting that expectation that this is what you need, and just picking that one thing just to get started with, because you could go online and you could see how you could very quickly tip your whole world upside down and try and make all of these adjustments. But it might just be as simple as going, you know what, looking ahead at the calendar and going, you know, I usually get pretty tired around my monthly cycle. I'm going to book my doctor's appointment this other day, or I'm not going to book my appointment with the kid's appointment, right? And sometimes that's challenging maybe to spread it out. But at the end of the day, the end of the weeks, at the end of the months, at the end of the years, we want to be feeling replenished and as best as we can. So, yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much. Keep it simple.